My sweet grandmother was a criminal. Her dark past finally caught up with our family. Grandma Rose made the best apple pie in 3 counties and never missed a single one of my soccer games. She volunteered at the church food bank every Tuesday, knitted scarves for homeless shelters every winter, and always had a pocket full of butterscotch candies for any child who crossed her path. At 84, she was the kind of grandmother you see in Norman Rockwell paintings. Silver hair, always perfectly curled, floral dresses that smelled like lavender, and a smile that could cure heartbreak. Which is why the FBI showing up at her door on a rainy Thursday morning felt like stepping into an alternate reality. I was visiting for our weekly coffee date when the black sedan pulled into her driveway. 2 agents in dark suits emerged, and something in their purposeful stride made my stomach clench. Grandma Rose, who had been watering her prized hydrangeas on the front porch, went completely still. "Mrs. Kowalski?" the taller agent asked, flashing his badge. "Agent Morrison, FBI. We need to speak with you about some old business." The transformation in my grandmother was instantaneous and terrifying. The sweet, gentle woman I'd known for 28 years vanished, replaced by someone with steel in her spine and calculation in her eyes. She set down the watering can with deliberate precision. "I wondered when you'd finally come," she said quietly, her Polish accent suddenly thicker than I'd ever heard it. "Tommy, go inside and make yourself some coffee. This might take a while." But I couldn't move. I stood frozen on those familiar porch steps, watching my world tilt off its axis as Agent Morrison read my grandmother her rights. The charges were staggering: conspiracy to commit armed robbery, accessory to murder, racketeering, and about 6 other felonies I couldn't process through my shock. Dates from the 1960s and 70s, names I'd never heard, crimes that painted a picture of a woman I didn't recognize. "There's been a mistake," I managed to say. "This is Rose Kowalski. She runs the church bake sale. She's never even gotten a parking ticket." Agent Morrison looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Sir, your grandmother was a key member of the Kowalski crime family that operated out of Chicago for over 2 decades. We've been building this case for 40 years. The ride to the federal courthouse was a blur of reporters and camera flashes. Grandma Rose, now in handcuffs, looked smaller somehow, but not broken. If anything, there was a resigned dignity in her posture that I'd never seen before. She caught my eye through the car window and mouthed, "I'm sorry, Tommy." Bail was set at $2 million, an impossible amount for a retired seamstress living on Social Security. But before I could even process that reality, a well-dressed lawyer I'd never seen before appeared, bail money in hand, and Grandma Rose was walking free within hours. "Who paid for this?" I asked as we climbed into his Mercedes. "Old friends," she said simply. "People who remember favors." The drive home was silent, except for my racing thoughts. Every childhood memory was suddenly suspect. The unexplained visitors who came by occasionally when I was young, men in expensive suits who spoke in hushed tones and left envelopes on the kitchen table. The way Grandma always seemed to have money for emergencies, despite claiming to live paycheck to paycheck. Her insistence that we never talk to strangers, especially anyone asking questions about family. Back at her house, she made tea with the same careful precision she'd used my entire life, but everything felt different now. The familiar kitchen seemed like a staged set for a play I'd never known I was watching. "Sit down, Tommy," she said, settling across from me at the same table where she'd helped me with homework for years. "It's time you learned about the woman who raised you." Her real name was Rosalia Kozlowska, and she'd arrived in Chicago in 1952 at 18, unable to speak English and carrying nothing but a cardboard suitcase and the address of a distant cousin. Post-war Poland had been hell, she explained, and America represented hope for a future that didn't involve constant fear and hunger. But America wasn't ready for Polish girls with no education and no connections, she continued, her hands wrapped around her teacup like it was an anchor. The only work I could find was in the factories, 12-hour shifts for barely enough to eat. I lived in a boarding house with 6 other girls in 2 rooms. That's where she met Stanley Kowalski, not my grandfather, but his older brother. Stanley ran numbers for the Chicago outfit and promised her easy money for simple tasks, delivering packages, passing messages, keeping her mouth shut. What started as desperation became something darker when she fell in love with him. Stanley was dangerous, but he was also kind to me when no one else cared if I lived or died, she said. When you're that young and that alone, kindness can make you do terrible things. The Kowalski operation started small: bookmaking, loan sharking, protection rackets. But by the late 1960s, they were moving into bigger scores. Grandma Rose's job was to case potential targets, often getting hired as cleaning lady or seamstress in wealthy homes to learn their routines and security weaknesses. I never carried a gun, she said, as if this distinction mattered. I never hurt anyone directly, but I helped plan robberies that sometimes went wrong. People got hurt because of information I provided. The murder charge stemmed from a jewelry store heist in 1971. The owner, an elderly man named Morris Goldstein, had tried to resist and was killed in the struggle. Grandma Rose had provided the floor plan and guard schedules that made the robbery possible. I quit after that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Seeing that man's photograph in the newspaper, reading about his grandchildren, I couldn't do it anymore. But quitting wasn't simple. Stanley had been killed in a gang war by then, and his younger brother, my actual grandfather, was trying to go legitimate. He and Rose disappeared from Chicago, changed their names, and started over in this small Indiana town where nobody asked questions about their past. Your grandfather was a good man who'd made bad choices, she said. We both were. We came here to build something clean, something honest. When he died, I kept that promise. For 30 years, she'd been exactly what she appeared to be: a devoted grandmother, community volunteer, and pillar of the church. But the past had patient teeth, and federal prosecutors don't forget unsolved murders, especially when new DNA evidence emerges. They found blood on some clothing from the jewelry store, she explained. Stanley's blood, but also mine. I'd cut myself on broken glass during the robbery. Technology caught up with choices I made 50 years ago. The next few months were a nightmare of legal proceedings, media attention, and family upheaval. My parents flew in from Arizona, struggling to reconcile the woman who'd raised them with the criminal she'd apparently been. The town was divided between neighbors who knew the Rose Kowalski they'd lived beside for decades and those who felt betrayed by her deception. The worst part was my own confusion. Every warm memory felt contaminated. The bedtime stories she'd told me about brave princesses and noble knights, had they been lies from someone who'd lived in shadows? The moral lessons about right and wrong, honesty and kindness, had they been hypocrisy from a woman with blood on her hands? But other details began making sense in disturbing ways. Her seemingly psychic ability to spot trouble before it happened, the way she could read people's intentions with uncanny accuracy, her insistence on always having emergency cash hidden in the house, skills learned in a world where survival depended on reading danger and preparing for the worst. The trial was a media circus. Federal prosecutors painted a picture of a cold-blooded criminal who'd evaded justice for decades. The defense portrayed a young immigrant woman who'd been exploited by men in a system that offered her no legitimate opportunities. Both versions were true, and both were incomplete. The most damaging testimony came from Tommy the Fish Torino, a former associate who'd been in witness protection for 20 years. He described in vivid detail how Rose Kowalski had planned the jewelry store job, how she'd seduced the night watchman to learn his routine, how she'd laughed when they heard about Goldstein's death on the news. Watching from the gallery, I wanted to scream that he was describing someone else, some criminal who wore my grandmother's face. But then I looked at Grandma Rose's expression, and I saw something that stopped my protest cold. She wasn't denying it. During a recess, I confronted her in the hallway. Is it true? What he said about you laughing? She was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands. I was 26 years old, Tommy. I thought I was tough, thought I could handle anything. When you're running with dangerous people, you learn to laugh at things that should make you cry. It's how you survive. But did you laugh? Yes, she whispered, and I've regretted it every day since. The prosecution's case was strong, but not airtight. Decades had passed, witnesses had died or disappeared, and evidence was largely circumstantial. More importantly, the woman in the courtroom bore little resemblance to the hardened criminal from the 1970s testimony. Character witnesses filled an entire afternoon. Mrs. Patterson from the church described Rose's tireless volunteer work. Coach Williams talked about her faithfully attending every one of my games, even in bad weather. Dr. Martinez testified about her caring for elderly neighbors during the flu outbreak of 2019. Your Honor, said elderly Father McKenna, leaning heavily on his walker, I've known Rose Kowalski for 30 years. Whatever she may have done in her past, the woman I know has spent decades making amends through service to others. She's baptized babies, comforted the dying, and fed the hungry. If that's not redemption, I don't know what is. The prosecution objected that good deeds don't erase murder, and they were legally correct. But something in the courtroom had shifted. The jury was seeing not just the criminal Rose had been, but the woman she'd become. During her own testimony, Grandma Rose was unflinchingly honest about her past while refusing to make excuses. I did terrible things, she said, her voice steady. I helped plan crimes that hurt innocent people. I was young and desperate and scared. But those aren't excuses, they're just explanations. Morris Goldstein died partly because of my actions, and I've carried that guilt for 50 years. She paused, looking directly at the jury. But I also believe that people can change. I've spent the last 3 decades trying to balance the scales, trying to put more good into the world than the evil I once helped create. I know that doesn't bring Mr. Goldstein back, and it doesn't erase what I did. But it means something. It has to mean something. The verdict came back after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on conspiracy charges, not guilty on the murder count. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in federal prison, but suspended all but 18 months in consideration of her age, health, and exemplary behavior for the past 30 years. Mrs. Kowalski, Judge Harrison said, this court recognizes that people are capable of fundamental change. While we cannot ignore your past crimes, we also cannot ignore the life you've built since then. You will serve 18 months, followed by 2 years of probation and community service. 18 months felt like a lifetime, but it also felt like mercy. The minimum security facility where Grandma Rose served her time was nothing like the federal penitentiaries you see in movies. It was more like a college dormitory with restricted privileges and terrible food. I visited every week and gradually began to understand something important. She was at peace for the first time in decades. I don't have to hide anymore, she told me during one visit. For 50 years, I've been waiting for this knock on the door. Now it's finally come, and I can stop running from who I used to be. She started a knitting circle in prison, teaching other inmates skills they could use after release. She tutored women studying for their GEDs and mediated disputes between inmates from different backgrounds. Even in federal custody, she couldn't stop being the person she'd become. The media attention faded, but the deeper questions remained. How do we reconcile the different versions of people we love? Can someone truly change, or do we just become better at hiding our true nature? What do we owe the people we've hurt, and what do they owe us in return? Morris Goldstein's grandson, David, reached out to our family during the trial. I'd expected anger, demands for justice, maybe even threats. Instead, he wanted to understand. I've spent 40 years hating faceless criminals, he told me over coffee. But your grandmother has a face now, and it's not the face of evil I'd imagined. That doesn't mean I forgive her, but it means I can stop carrying so much anger. When Grandma Rose was released, she moved into a small apartment near the facility where she'd be completing her community service. The house where I'd grown up visiting her felt too full of ghosts and reporters. But she seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by decades of secrets. I'm not proud of who I was, she told me on her first day of freedom, but I'm not ashamed of who I became. Both women are me, Tommy. Both are real. She returned to volunteering at the food bank, though now her past added weight to her work with people who'd made their own mistakes. Ex-convicts, addicts in recovery, immigrants struggling with systems they didn't understand. They saw in her someone who'd walked through darkness and found her way back to the light. The church congregation was divided about welcoming her back, but Father McKenna settled the debate with characteristic directness. Christ ate with tax collectors and sinners. If we can't forgive an 84-year-old woman who spent 30 years serving this community, then we've forgotten what we claim to believe. 2 years later, at my wedding, Grandma Rose walked me down the aisle. My father had died when I was young, and she'd helped raise me. As we made that slow journey toward my bride, I realized that the woman holding my arm was exactly who she'd always been. Someone who'd made terrible mistakes, learned from them, and spent the rest of her life trying to make amends. The criminal and the grandmother weren't separate people. They were chapters in the same complicated story of a human being trying to survive, then thrive, then serve something larger than herself. Morris Goldstein's grandson attended the wedding. He didn't speak to Grandma Rose, but he nodded to her across the reception hall. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was acknowledgement that healing sometimes requires seeing each other's full humanity. Grandma Rose lived 4 more years after her release, long enough to meet my first child. Holding her great-granddaughter, she looked exactly like the grandmother from my childhood memories, full of love, hope, and fierce protectiveness. "What will you tell her about me?" she asked one afternoon as we sat on her apartment balcony, watching the baby sleep. "The truth," I said, "that you made mistakes when you were young, paid for them when you were old, and spent most of your life trying to balance the scales. That people can change, but change requires acknowledging what needs changing." She smiled, the same smile that had comforted me through childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. "That's all any of us can do, Tommy. Make mistakes, learn from them, and try to leave the world a little better than we found it." When she died peacefully in her sleep at 88, the funeral was standing room only. Former inmates she'd mentored sat beside church ladies she'd served with for decades. FBI agents who'd investigated her case attended alongside neighbors who'd never known about her past until the trial. The eulogy was given by David Goldstein, Morris's grandson, who'd spent 2 years getting to know the woman who'd helped plan his grandfather's death. "Rose Kowalski was a criminal," he said from the pulpit. "She participated in acts that caused my family tremendous pain. But she was also a woman who recognized her mistakes and spent 40 years making amends. She couldn't bring my grandfather back, but she could, and did, prevent other families from experiencing similar losses through her work with at-risk youth and ex-offenders." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "I don't know if what she did was enough to balance the scales. That's not for me to judge. But I know that the world is better because she chose to change, and because she refused to let her past define her future." Standing at her graveside, I realized that Grandma Rose's greatest crime wasn't the robberies or even her role in Morris Goldstein's death. It was letting me believe that good people and bad people were different species, that morality was a permanent condition rather than a daily choice. The truth was more complicated and more hopeful. We're all capable of both terrible and wonderful things. What matters isn't the mistakes we've made, but what we do with the time we have left to make things right. The butterscotch candies in her purse were still there when we cleaned out her apartment, along with thank you letters from dozens of people whose lives she'd touched. In her bedside drawer, I found a photograph of Morris Goldstein that she'd kept all these years, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the cost of her choices. My sweet grandmother was a criminal, but she was also a saint. Both things were true, and both mattered, and learning to hold that contradiction was perhaps the most important lesson she ever taught me.